One positive side effect of the Titanic was that all ships were later required to have enough lifeboat capacity for all passengers. What is another example of a positive that came out of a tragedy? Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911. In New York, they didn't even have a ladder at the time that would reach the floors on fire. The water from the fire hoses could not reach the flames. The doors opened inward instead of outward. So the people desperate to get out literally couldn't open the door because of the weight of the people pushing against them. Other doors were chained shut to prevent workers from taking breaks or pro-union people sneaking in. The workers were squeezed in like sardines. There were no sprinklers at the time. The water wasn't even turned on for the fire hose they had inside. People were smoking next to highly flammable fabric. The fire escape fell off of the building with people on it because it couldn't handle the weight. They had never conducted a fire drill, ever. Some of these were blatant code violations. Others weren't required at the time. But the deaths of 146 people, mostly teenage girls, with the youngest victim being just 11 years old, major changes to the fire safety codes of the time. Certain commercial utility trucks are now required to have an audible signal when the vehicle's transmission is placed in reverse. The relentless beep 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 sound can be annoying, but it helps save lives after many accidents where someone was unaware a truck was backing up and accidentally got hit. There were 2 American tourists who got left behind by a boat in the reefs outside of Queensland. No one really knows what happened to them, but probably drowning and sharks. Now all over Australia, they have a very clear set of rules to make sure everyone is on the boat back. In 2009 I went snorkeling off a boat in Mexico. It was raining and the water was choppy as heck. Not only could I not see a dang thing underwater, but the choppiness made it extremely difficult to follow and keep up with the instructor. I don't even remember them doing a head count or anything to make sure everyone got back on the boat. In Singapore, an exchange student was waiting for the train when a crowd formed behind her and she ended up being pushed onto the tracks right when a train was arriving. The train cut off her legs. Since then, all Singapore train platforms have had barriers. Getting pushed onto the tracks as a train is coming is literally one of my nightmares. We just blindly trust that no one standing behind us is a complete psychopath. After the reactor in Chernobyl blew up due to pressure buildup in the containment, all reactors worldwide were equipped with emergency valves to release pressure in order to maintain the integrity of the containment in a worst case accident. They also started moving towards passive cooling systems, where reactors are filled with chemicals which, if they reach a temperature higher than the reactor's standard operating limit, bond to form powerful coolant agents to cool the reactor back down automatically, with no operator input and no moving parts that could fail. Laws mandating fire escape maintenance came about after an infamous incident in Boston in the 1970s. There's an iconic Pulitzer Award photograph showing a woman and child falling off the side of a building after a fire escape fell off the building during a fire. After I became a firefighter, I learned that pretty much every safety code in the NFPA manual is the result of someone dying. It's the same way with every regulation for the railroad industry. Trial and error has made a large amount of our regulations, which is alarming to think about. The Tenerife disaster in which 2 747s collided on the runway led to many changes. 2 of the most important were standardizing how pilots talk on the radio, firstly to ensure they all speak English and then to make sure they always use the correct words. The word takeoff is only used when giving permission to take off, otherwise they will use departure. The other innovation was crew resource management, which teaches pilots not to always use the captain as the sole decision maker and to work as a team instead. These innovations have saved millions of lives over the years. After the Great Molasses Spill in Boston during the 1910s, the government got much stricter with calculations regarding anything that was being built in major cities, especially near high population density cities. Before this, you could kinda just get away with the engineer doing the calculations, and everyone else kinda just assumed they were correct. Now, all of the calculations done by engineers and architects are filed through the city before anything actually gets done. If you don't know what the spill was, a molasses tank, 50 featuring tall, 90 featuring wide, that was holding like 2.3 million gallons of molasses burst due to cylindrical stresses on the container. Sounds hilarious in your head until you realize the molasses then flooded the streets at 35 miles per hour, killing more than 20 people and injuring like 150. Yikes. 2.37 million. Fun thing to think about, if it really was 2.3 billion gallons, the tank would have to be 50,000 featuring tall while remaining 90 feet wide. LOL. Just about every law that the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, has mandated is written in the blood of someone else's mishap. After 9/11, a lot of people started tuning into the Food Network, as it was one of the few channels whose programming didn't dedicate significant time to the attacks. The uptick in general viewership motivated Food Network to create more varied programming, rather than the previously homogeneous cook this simple dish in your kitchen shows. This is a bit more tangential than some of the other comments in here. After the disgusting conditions of the meatpacking industry was exposed by the book The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, the FDA was created to help ensure basic sanitary practices in the food industry as a whole. My favorite part of this is that Upton Sinclair was trying to expose the exploitation of workers in that book, and only used the meatpacking industry as a medium for that conversation. But the meatpacking industry information was so alarming that it overshadowed the rest of his argument and no one paid any attention to anything else. Veterans returning from World War I often had serious injuries, including blindness from gas attacks, shrapnel, or trauma. In addition, during World War I, the Halifax explosion in 1917 was the largest mass blinding in Canadian history from all the flying glass and debris. As a result of these tragedies, many charities and the Canadian National Institute for the Blind were created that helped people with vision loss to improve their lives. Before this, there were almost no supports for blind people, and in Britain, the aftermath of World War II provided an opportunity to create the National Health Service. Also gave birth to reconstructive surgery, plastic surgery. I believe the dropping of atomic weapons on Japan at the end of World War II is the only thing that has prevented a larger nuclear conflict. If no one had ever actually seen the destruction and the continuing torment through generations due to radiation, history might look very different if anyone was around to read it. It's one thing to see a big explosion and think, oh, that's destructive as heck. It's entirely different to see that happen in a city. So, tragic as it is, I think the Japanese sacrifice, unwilling though it was, has likely saved the rest of the world from itself. At least up till now. Let's try not to forget past lessons. Yeah? You're probably right. The world wars kept raising the bar for destructive weapons. Nukes seemed to be the first time world powers looked at an explosive device and went, oh crap. It's one thing to know it'll be devastating because of numbers. It's another to realize two cities no longer exist because of one bomb each. Can't remember the names, but back in the 60s or 70s some lady killed her husband by opening the capsule containing Excedrin and added cyanide to it. When he took the pill for a headache, he instantly dropped dead. To make it look like it was a random act of violence, she poisoned another Excedrin bottle at the local grocery store and awaited another person in town to drop dead, which sure enough someone did. She got caught and went to prison. But after that, now capsules for medication cannot be put back together once they have been opened. They have special foil on those things that show if the bottle's been tampered with now ever since the cyanide Tylenol killings in the 80s. Before the Nazis rose to power, eugenics and anti-Semitism were very popular in the West. After World War II not so much, only villains go for that stuff. Yet, many of the Nazis' ultimate evils were just popular ideas of the time being implemented. Sadly, however, many of those ideas didn't die after World War II. Fritz Haber invented the Haber-Bosch process of pulling nitrogen from air, so Germany could continue making explosives, led to many uses, such as fertilizers. The Mansfield bar, which is the bar at the back of a truck which stops a car from having its top sheared off in a collision. No one died, but the Tacoma Bridge collapse did a lot to help future bridges and improve the codes when building bridges. No one died, except for one dog. In 1963, the nuclear submarine the USS Thresher was on its first deep dive test off the coast of Massachusetts. A cascading set of failures thought to have been triggered by a pipe elbow brace that wasn't up to standards ultimately caused the sub to take on water and sink to crush depth, killing all aboard. In the wake of losing the sub, the Navy instituted the SubSafe program, which requires exacting standards and full traceability in critical areas components. The Navy has only lost one other nuclear sub since, and the Scorpion's demise is not fully understood and is theorized to be anything from a torpedo auto-detonation to the Russians to mechanical failure causing a death spiral. The point is that the program has been highly successful at keeping subs from going to the bottom of the ocean by accident. Submarines are scary, man. They only operate in the top 20% of the ocean. All the time they're just floating above the vast yawning darkness below them, and if something goes wrong, it can't go wrong in a safe way. You can't have a malfunction and float upwards. Just sink downwards. Massive respect to submariners. After 9/11, basically every sharp object was banned from flights. Americans haven't seen a successful plane hijacking since the terrorist attack. Americans will frick you up if you try to seize a plane. Prior to 9/11, there had been hijackings where people were used as bargaining chips but survived the ordeal. After 9/11, every single passenger now knows that a hijacked plane means almost certain death. The prospect of certain death leads people to do a lot of crazy things. Sitting submissively in their seats just isn't one of them. World War I and II advanced technology at breakneck speeds. Within 50 years we went from cavalry charges and trench warfare to planes and tanks. And then the Cold War happened, and 50 years after World War II we had the internet and satellites. Before the AIDS scare in the US in the 80s, people working in labs etc. performed mouth pipetting, meaning you used a little tube in your mouth to draw up patient samples into a pipette, didn't wear gloves, ate and drank right on the workbench, smoked in the lab, and did all sorts of other stuff that would potentially expose them to bloodborne pathogens. There was no separate container for sharps and that kind of thing. So a ton of our safety in healthcare came about because of that. We've actually experienced another round of upgrades since the Ebola case. Crap, just realized I used those pipettes from around the turn of the millennium. Yeah, that place is closed now. I-35 bridge collapse, I think summer 2006 or 2007, led to a discussion about work on infrastructure and bridges around the state. Now I drive over the new bridge in that same spot to get home from work each weekday. It's so solid and well kept up. The death of Ayrton Senna during a Formula 1 race in 1994, leading to better safety precautions in the sport. They changed some track layouts, improved crash barriers, and made the cars safer in a collision. Several years ago, a Germanwings plane was flown into a mountain by the co-pilot because he was depressed about his girlfriend. FAA laws in the US have required at minimum 2 people in the cockpit at all times since the 70s, I believe. European laws have been switched to match the US ones. I don't know if it's positive, but sadly a bunch of people had to die to get that glaring oversight fixed. Tragedies like these are basically where all rules and regulations come from. Regardless of industry, sector, etc. Regulations exist as solutions to problems. This is also why people who propose doing away with regulations for the sake of doing away with them arbitrarily, or that regulations are an inherently bad thing, are morons. Karen Wetterhan was a chemist, and during an experiment, 1 drop of dimethylmercury fell on one of her gloves. She took all necessary measures related to mercury exposition, but since it was only 1 drop and then followed the security protocol in case of accidental exposition, she thought she was going to be fine and didn't really sweat over it. 1 year later she painfully died of a fatal mercury exposition due to the incident. Turns out that latex gloves aren't protective enough. Her death shook the scientific community, and ever since special gloves are used in order to manipulate mercury. Without this incident, we'd probably had more accident like that happen. The Apollo 1 fire that killed astronauts Grissom, White and Chaffee was caused by an inwardly opening hatch and a pure oxygen environment. Was fixed by going to an outward opening hatch and an O2 mixture. Titanic had a bunch more of these than just the lifeboats. When Titanic struck the iceberg, the Californian was only 30 minutes away, but the radio operator had shut off for the night only a few minutes before Titanic sent her first distress signal. Now there must be radio operators ready to respond to distress calls at all times. The Californian had also witnessed Titanic's distress flares and had contemplated if it was an emergency. At the time there was no standard for flares at sea, so they decided not to do anything. Today, any flare or firework at sea must be interpreted as a distress call. Due to poor non-existent training, the crew of Titanic was not prepared for the emergency. They failed to fill some of the lifeboats to capacity. Some were even less than half filled to their safe limit. They also lost one lifeboat due to not knowing how to properly launch it. Today, all ship crews must go through mandatory drills and extensive training protocols so they are prepared in an emergency. Also, ships were later retrofitted to be able to handle similar catastrophes, and ice patrols became a thing. Post-World War II Japan. After they relinquished their military, the money they had was able to be put into the infrastructure, and they experienced an unprecedented economic boom. In the 1980s, someone tampered with Tylenol bottles in Chicago and laced them with cyanide. After several deaths, people figured out what had happened, and now we have over-the-counter pill bottles that show when they've been tampered with. Tamper-proof medicine became mandatory after a string of deadly poisonings had been linked to bottles of Tylenol in Chicago. I like this story because the makers of Tylenol didn't frick around when police made them aware of the link. They did not try and cover it up or deny anything. Instead, they immediately ordered all stores nationwide to destroy their stocks of Tylenol. They also took out full-page ads begging the public to turn in their own bottles for replacements. It was estimated that the incident ended up costing the makers over $100 million worth of product. They were then very proactive and took a hands-on approach to the development of the tamper-proof methods we use today. The collapse of the Silver Bridge in Point Pleasant, West Virginia in 1967 led to a nationwide effort to inspect and repair older bridges that had previously been neglected. While we still have a ton of infrastructure problems, many potentially fatal faults may have been found and repaired. I have a smaller example. In the town I grew up in, there was a crossing guard in front of the elementary school, but not at the intersection down the street. A lot of kids, me included, had to cross there to walk home. There was a walking signal, but it was very short for little kids trying to run across a 4-lane road with their book bags. One Saturday, 2 boys were walking to the school to use the playground, which was really common. They waited for the walking signal to cross, but the truck in the far lane did not wait for the green light. The younger boy was still near the median when the older one was it. They rewired the walking signal and stationed a crossing guard there after that. After the tornado outbreak in April 2011, all new schools built in the state of Alabama were required to have a portion of the building that was reinforced to withstand a tornado in case students and staff needed to take shelter. In my high school, the band, choir, and drama rooms literally had missile impact resistance signs outside the rooms. For once, the state government did not play around. Human experiments conducted by Japan in World War II gave us the knowledge that the best way to warm up freezing limbs is to submerge them in water ranging from 108 to 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Not saying I agree with abortion, but I read a book, one of the Freakonomics books, that talked about how abortion has dropped the crime rate. Please don't hate me for this. After 9/11, airport security was greatly tightened, and now there's an off chance that at some point when I'm traveling I'll be pat down, receiving a small amount of physical contact with another human being. You don't even have to wine and dine them first. The Eastland sank primarily because it had too many lifeboats. Congress made a law after the Titanic requiring ships to have 75% passenger capacity in lifeboats. Despite the objections of specialists, the Eastland was fitted with so many lifeboats it rolled over, drowning 844. It wasn't because it had too many lifeboats, it was that the lifeboats were stored on the upper decks. Dale Earnhardt's death forced a mandate for drivers to use harness devices. Stabilizes the neck, I believe. NASCAR used to have a driver die once about every year or two. No driver has died in a major series since. Concussions and broken backs can be an issue still, but death, not so much. Nothing as big as the Titanic, but at traffic light at College Parkway and Baydale Drive. Both my sister and I had two separate car accidents at the same intersection. Horrible setup with no turning lanes and a steep angled shoulder. After the second really bad accident, the state put a light there within 2 weeks. Amber Alerts. Named after a real child, Amber. She was murdered, and in the wake of grief her mother founded the Amber Alert program to help protect the lives of other children. A terrible tragedy and touching example of taking pain and transforming it into care. The Adam Warning in stores. Named after Adam Walsh. The death of Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and Benny the Bopper rendered one of the most metaphorically deep and thought-provoking folk ballads of all time. After Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper died in their plane crash, a law was made that required authorities to notify the relatives of a recently deceased person before the public. School busing rules changed after an incident in 1938. Bus drivers were already required to stop at railroad tracks at this time. When traveling with a bus full of kids in a near blizzard, the bus driver made the usual stop and then proceeded to cross the tracks, where he was hit with a train. The train collided at 60 miles per hour and dragged the bus half a mile before it could stop. 25 children and the bus driver died. After that, in addition to stopping at railroad tracks, bus drivers are required to open their doors and windows to listen for the train before proceeding. In the UK, the Hillsborough Tragedy 1989 football stadium was allowed to get ridiculously overfilled and 96 people died. Repercussions are still going on, but since then league football stadiums' safety has greatly improved and higher level stadiums are required to be all-seater. There is currently a campaign to reintroduce safe standing. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.